Maria wiped her hands on her apron and checked her reflection in the kitchen mirror one last time. Tonight was different from her usual quiet evenings cleaning the Wellington mansion. Tonight, the house would be filled with the city's wealthiest. People all dressed in expensive clothes and sparkling jewelry. She had been working for the Wellington family for 3 years now, and charity galas like this one always made her nervous. The sound of cars pulling up the long driveway told her the guests were starting to arrive. Through the kitchen window, she could see luxury vehicles dropping off men in perfect black suits and women in flowing gowns that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. Maria straightened her simple black uniform and took a deep breath. She needed this job. Back home in the Philippines, her 2 children were counting on the money she sent every month. Walking through the service hallway, Maria could hear the chatter and laughter growing louder. The Wellington estate was massive, with rooms that seemed to go on forever. But tonight, everything was happening in the grand ballroom, a room so beautiful it looked like something from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks, casting rainbow patterns on the polished marble floor. As Maria pushed through the swinging doors into the ballroom, the scene took her breath away, just like it did every time. Round tables covered in white silk surrounded a small stage where a professional pianist sat at a gorgeous black piano. The music floated through the air, mixing with the gentle clink of champagne glasses and the rustle of expensive fabric as people moved around the room. Maria had learned to move quietly at these events. She was like a ghost, appearing when someone needed their glass refilled or when empty plates needed to be cleared away. Most of the guests never really looked at her. To them, she was just part of the background, like the furniture or the flowers. Sometimes she wondered what it would be like to be one of them, to wear a beautiful dress and have real conversations, instead of just saying, "Yes, ma'am," and "Right away, sir." The charity tonight was raising money for children's education, which made Maria think of her own kids back home. Her daughter Rosa was 12 and dreamed of becoming a teacher. Her son Carlos was only 8 but already showed talent in music just like Maria once had. She pushed those thoughts away. This wasn't the time for memories. Moving between the tables, Maria noticed the usual groups forming. The older wealthy couples stood near the stage, nodding along to the classical music and discussing business deals between sips of wine. The younger crowd gathered near the bar, their voices louder and their laughter sharper. They were the children of the older guests, people who had never worked a day in their lives but acted like they owned the world. Mrs. Wellington, her employer, was easy to spot in her emerald green gown. She was a kind woman who always treated Maria with respect. Unlike some of the other wealthy families Maria had heard about from her friends who worked in similar jobs, Mrs. Wellington would sometimes ask about Maria's children and always remembered their names. It was a small kindness that meant more than Mrs. Wellington probably realized. As the evening went on, Maria fell into her familiar rhythm. She knew exactly when to appear with a fresh drink and when to step back into the shadows. She had memorized the layout of every table and could navigate the room without bumping into anyone, even when carrying a full tray. The work was tiring, but she had done this so many times that her body moved automatically. The professional pianist was talented, she had to admit. He played the kind of classical pieces that made the wealthy guests feel sophisticated. Maria recognized most of the songs from her own past, a time that felt like a different lifetime now. She tried not to think about those days too much. It only made the present harder to bear. During a brief break in her duties, Maria found herself standing near a group of women discussing their children's private schools and expensive vacations. One woman complained that her daughter's piano lessons were costing a fortune, and the child barely seemed interested. Another mentioned how difficult it was to find really good help these days, as if Maria wasn't standing right there. She had learned not to react to comments like these. Getting upset wouldn't change anything, and she couldn't afford to lose this job. The food being served tonight was the kind Maria had only seen in magazines before working here. Tiny portions of expensive ingredients arranged like works of art on white plates. The guests picked at their food while talking about stock prices and real estate deals. Maria thought about the simple rice and vegetables she would eat later in her small room upstairs, and she wasn't envious. She had learned that fancy food didn't necessarily taste better than a home-cooked meal. As she cleared another table, Maria caught a glimpse of herself in one of the room's many mirrors. Her uniform was clean and pressed, her hair pulled back neatly, but she looked tired. The long hours were starting to show on her face. She was only 42, but sometimes she felt much older. Working in a house full of luxury while sending most of her money home meant she rarely bought anything nice for herself. The pianist announced he would be taking a short break, and the guests barely seemed to notice as the music stopped. They were too busy with their conversations about things Maria couldn't relate to: summer houses in Europe, their children's expensive colleges, and charity work that was more about being seen than actually helping people. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was serving people who were supposedly raising money to help children, while her own children lived thousands of miles away, because she couldn't find decent work in her home country. Standing near the flower arrangements she had helped prepare earlier that day, Maria allowed herself a moment to really look at the piano. It was a beautiful instrument, probably worth more than she would make in 5 years. The pianist had left his sheet music on the stand, and even from a distance, Maria could see it was Chopin. She knew that piece well. Too well. The sound of laughter brought her back to the present. She had work to do, and daydreaming wouldn't help anyone. But as she picked up her tray and prepared to make another round of the tables, Maria didn't realize that her quiet evening was about to change in a way she never could have imagined. Sometimes life has a funny way of putting you exactly where you need to be, even when you least expect it. The professional pianist stood up from the bench and announced to the room that he would be taking a 15-minute break. Most guests barely looked up from their conversations, but the absence of music created a strange quietness that seemed to hang in the air. Maria was arranging fresh white roses in a tall vase near the piano when she heard footsteps approaching behind her. Well, what do we have here?" a voice said loudly, cutting through the gentle murmur of conversation. Maria turned to see Richard Wellington III, Mrs. Wellington's nephew, standing with 3 of his friends. They all looked to be in their mid-20s, wearing expensive suits that probably cost more than Maria's entire wardrobe. Richard had the kind of confident smile that came from never being told no. Never facing real consequences for his actions. Maria had met Richard a few times before during family gatherings. He was the type of person who spoke to staff like they were invisible, or worse, like they were entertainment for him and his friends. She had learned to avoid him when possible, but tonight there was nowhere to go. The piano area was somewhat isolated from the main crowd, as she was trapped between the instrument and the wall of windows. "Maria, isn't it?" Richard continued, even though he knew perfectly well what her name was. "I was just telling my friends here about how we have the most talented staff working for my aunt. Isn't that right, guys?" His friends chuckled, clearly in on whatever joke Richard was building up to. Maria could feel her stomach start to knot up. She had experienced this kind of attention before, and it never ended well for her. "I was wondering," Richard said, his voice getting louder so that nearby guests started to turn their heads. "Since our pianist is taking a break, maybe you could fill in for him? I bet you have some amazing musical talents hidden away." The way he said musical talents made it clear he was mocking her. His friends started to grin wider, anticipating whatever show Richard was about to create. Maria felt her face getting warm. "I'm sorry, sir, but I need to get back to work," she said quietly, hoping to end the conversation and escape. But Richard wasn't done with her yet. In fact, her polite refusal seemed to encourage him even more. "Oh, come on, don't be shy," Richard said, raising his voice another notch. By now, at least a dozen guests had stopped their conversations to watch what was happening. "I'm sure everyone here would love to hear some authentic Filipino music. Maybe something traditional from your homeland?" The way he said homeland made it sound exotic and foreign, like Maria was some kind of curiosity rather than a person. One of Richard's friends, a tall guy with perfectly styled blonde hair, joined in. "Yeah, Maria, don't leave us hanging. We're all about cultural appreciation here." The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. The other two friends nodded enthusiastically, like they were watching their favorite comedy show. Maria looked around the room and realized that more and more people were starting to pay attention. Some had even pulled out their phones, probably, expecting to capture something funny to share on social media later. The thought of being turned into some kind of internet joke made her feel sick to her stomach, but what could she do? Richard was her employer's nephew, and making a scene would only make things worse. "I really don't think that's appropriate." "Sir," Maria tried again, keeping her voice as calm and respectful as possible. She had learned over the years that staying polite was often the only way to survive these situations. Getting angry or defensive would just give them more ammunition to use against her, but Richard was clearly enjoying himself too much to stop now. "Appropriate? What's not appropriate about sharing your culture with us? We're all friends here." He started clapping his hands slowly, making a big show of it. "Come on, everyone. Let's encourage Maria to share her musical gifts with us." To Maria's horror, some of the other guests actually started clapping along. Not all of them, many looked uncomfortable with what was happening, but enough to make her feel like she was standing in front of a crowd at a circus. She could see phones being raised higher, people positioning themselves to get the best angle for whatever embarrassing moment they thought was about to happen. The worst part was that she could see Mrs. Wellington across the room. Her employer was watching the whole thing happen, but she wasn't moving to stop it. Maria couldn't tell if Mrs. Wellington was afraid to embarrass her own nephew in front of all these important guests, or if she simply didn't care enough about Maria to intervene. Either way, Maria felt completely alone. "Look at her, she's being modest," said the third friend, a guy with dark hair who was recording everything on his phone. "I bet she's actually really talented and just doesn't want to show off." "Come on, Maria, we won't judge you if you're not concert-level quality. We just want to hear something authentic." The word authentic stung. Maria knew what they meant by that. They wanted her to play something that would confirm their assumptions about who she was and where she came from. They wanted her to be the stereotype they had in their minds, not the real person she actually was. Richard walked closer to the piano and patted the bench. "The stage is all yours, Maria. Don't worry if you only know simple songs. We're not expecting anything too complicated." His friends laughed at this. As if the idea of Maria knowing complex music was hilarious, more guests had gathered around now, forming a loose circle around the piano area. Some looked genuinely curious about what would happen next. Others seemed uncomfortable but weren't willing to speak up and stop what was clearly becoming a cruel spectacle. A few were openly smiling, enjoying the entertainment that Maria's discomfort was providing them. Maria's hands were shaking slightly as she stood there, trying to figure out what to do. She could refuse again and try to walk away, but Richard seemed determined to keep pushing until he got what he wanted. She could play something simple and hope they would lose interest quickly. Or she could do something else entirely, something that none of them were expecting. The room had grown quieter as more people realized something was happening near the piano. Even the conversations at the far tables had died down as guests strained to see what the commotion was about. Maria felt like she was standing under a spotlight, exposed and vulnerable, while dozens of wealthy strangers waited to see her fail or be humiliated for their amusement. She thought about her children back home, about how hard she worked to maintain her dignity in a job that often stripped it away piece by piece. She thought about all the times she had bitten her tongue and smiled politely while being treated like she was less than human. And for the first time in years, something inside her started to shift. Richard wasn't going to let this moment slip away. Maria's polite refusal only seemed to fuel his determination to turn her into the evening's entertainment. He looked around at the growing crowd of onlookers and flashed that same confident smile that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. "Come on, everyone," Richard called out, his voice carrying across the ballroom like he was hosting his own show. "Let's give Maria some real encouragement here." He started clapping again, but this time it was slower and more deliberate, the kind of clapping that demanded attention. The sound echoed off the high ceiling, making it impossible for anyone in the room to ignore what was happening. His friends immediately joined in, their claps perfectly timed with Richard's. "Maria! Maria!" They started chanting, turning her name into some kind of sports stadium cheer. The sound made Maria's stomach turn. She had never felt so small in her entire life, standing there in her simple black uniform while people in $1,000 outfits treated her like a performing animal. To her horror, more guests started joining in with the clapping. Not everyone. She could see some people looking away uncomfortably or whispering to each other with worried expressions. But enough people were clapping that the sound filled the entire ballroom. Some of them probably thought they were being supportive, not realizing they were part of something cruel. Others clearly knew exactly what they were doing and were enjoying every second of it. That's the spirit. Richard shouted over the noise. "I just know Maria has been dying to show off her musical abilities, haven't you, Maria?" He looked directly at her with those cold blue eyes that held no warmth or kindness. "I bet you know all the beautiful traditional songs from your country. Maybe something really authentic that we've never heard before." The way he said authentic made Maria's skin crawl. She knew what he really meant. He wanted her to play something that would make her seem foreign and different, something that would confirm whatever stereotypes he and his friends had about people like her. They weren't interested in her as a person, they just wanted her to be their entertainment for the evening. One of Richard's friends, the blonde one who had spoken earlier, stepped closer to Maria with his phone still recording. "Don't worry. If it's not perfect," he said with fake kindness dripping from his voice, "we're not expecting Carnegie Hall quality here. Just play whatever comes naturally to you." The way he emphasized naturally made it clear he expected something simple and unsophisticated. Another friend chimed in. "Yeah, maybe something you learned as a kid. I bet your grandmother taught you some beautiful folk songs." They were boxing her in with their assumptions, trying to force her into the role they had created for her in their minds. They had already decided who she was and what she was capable of, and nothing she could say would change that. The worst part was watching more phones come out. People who had been having normal conversations just minutes ago were now holding up their devices, ready to capture whatever embarrassing moment was about to unfold. Maria realized that whatever happened next would probably end up on the internet, shared and reshared by people who would never see her as anything more than a joke. "Look at her, she's getting shy," Richard announced to his audience. "Maybe we need to make this a little more official." He walked over to the piano and dramatically pulled out the bench like he was preparing a concert stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present tonight's special musical guest, our very own Maria." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some people clapped enthusiastically, caught up in Richard's theatrical energy. Others looked increasingly uncomfortable, finally starting to realize that this wasn't just harmless fun. A few older guests were whispering among themselves, and Maria caught fragments of their conversations, inappropriate and "poor woman" and "someone should stop this." But nobody was stopping it. Mrs. Wellington was still across the room, talking to a group of potential donors as if nothing unusual was happening. Maria wondered if her employer was deliberately ignoring the situation, or if she simply didn't want to cause a scene by confronting her own nephew in front of all these important guests. Either way, Maria felt completely abandoned. "We're all waiting," Richard said, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. The friendly mask was starting to slip, and Maria could see the entitled brat underneath. "Don't keep your audience waiting, Maria. That would be rude, wouldn't it?" His dark-haired friend laughed and pointed his phone camera directly at Maria's face. "This is going to be great content," he said, not even trying to hide what he was doing. "My followers are going to love this. It's so refreshing to see real, authentic culture instead of all the fake stuff we usually see." Maria felt trapped in a nightmare. She was surrounded by people with more money than she would ever see in her lifetime. People who could ruin her life with a single phone call if she upset them. But they were treating her like she existed solely for their amusement. The worst part was that some of them probably thought they were being nice, that they were giving her a chance to share her culture or show her talents. Maybe she doesn't actually know how to play, suggested the blonde friend with a cruel grin. I mean, not everyone has had the privilege of proper music education. Maybe we're asking too much of her. The fake concern in his voice was more insulting than outright. Rudeness would have been. Richard's eyes lit up at this new angle. Oh, that's a good point. Maria, do you actually know how to play piano? I just assumed ... but maybe I was wrong. He was giving her an out, but it was the kind of out that would humiliate her even more. If she admitted she couldn't play, they would probably make jokes about her pretending to be something she wasn't. If she claimed she could play but then refused, they would call her a liar. The circle of onlookers had grown even larger. Maria estimated that at least half the party was now watching this spectacle unfold. Some people were taking pictures in addition to videos, like she was some kind of tourist attraction. She could hear whispered conversations in multiple languages, English, French, what sounded like German, as international guests tried to figure out what was happening. You know what? Richard said, his voice getting louder and more theatrical. I think Maria is just being modest. I bet she's actually incredibly talented and doesn't want to make the rest of us feel bad about our own musical abilities. His friends laughed at this obvious sarcasm. But we insist, don't we, everyone? We absolutely insist on hearing Maria play. The clapping started up again, even louder this time. Maria felt like the walls were closing in around her. She thought about her daughter Rosa, who was always so proud when Maria told her about working for wealthy people. What would Rosa think if she saw her mother being treated like this? What would her son Carlos think if he saw the video that was definitely going to end up online? But then something strange happened. As Maria stood there, feeling smaller and more powerless than she had in years, a different kind of feeling started growing inside her. It wasn't anger exactly, and it wasn't fear anymore. It was something else entirely, something that reminded her of who she used to be before life forced her to become invisible. Something deep inside Maria's chest began to stir, like a sleeping bird suddenly waking up after years of silence. She stood there, surrounded by the sounds of clapping and mocking laughter, but for the first time all evening she wasn't really hearing them anymore. Instead, she was hearing something else entirely, the faint echo of music that had once filled her life completely. The feeling started small, just a tiny spark of something she had buried so deep she almost forgot it existed. It was the memory of her 22-year-old self, standing on a real stage in Manila, wearing a beautiful blue dress that her mother had saved for months to buy. The memory of hundreds of people clapping not to mock her, but because they had just heard something that moved them. The memory of feeling like she belonged somewhere, like she had a purpose beyond. Just surviving. Maria's eyes slowly moved from Richard's sneering face to the piano behind him. The Steinway sat there like a sleeping giant, its black surface reflecting the crystal chandelier lights above. She had cleaned that piano dozens of times over the past 3 years, carefully dusting each key, polishing the wood until it gleamed. But she had never touched it the way it was meant to be touched. She had never let her fingers remember what they once knew how to do. What's it going to be, Maria? Richard pressed, his voice cutting through her thoughts. Are you going to play? For us, or are you going to keep us waiting all night? His friends were still recording everything, their phones pointed at her like weapons. The crowd around them had grown quiet. Sensing that something was about to happen, but not sure what, Maria looked around the room one more time. She saw Mrs. Wellington still pretending not to notice what was happening. She saw the uncomfortable faces of guests who wanted to help but didn't want to get involved. She saw the excited expressions of people who were enjoying the show. And she saw all those phones, ready to capture whatever humiliation Richard was trying to create. But then she thought about Rosa, her 12-year-old daughter, who believed her mother was the strongest woman in the world. Rosa, who didn't know that Maria spent most of her days being treated like she was invisible. Rosa, who still asked about the piano lessons she had to stop taking when Maria left the Philippines. What would Rosa want her mother to do right now? She thought about Carlos, her 8-year-old son, who hummed constantly and made up little songs while he played. Carlos, who had inherited her musical ear and her love of melody. Carlos, who deserved to see that dreams don't have to die just because life gets hard, and then she thought about herself. Not the Maria who cleaned houses and served drinks and bit her tongue when people were cruel, but the real Maria, the one who had spent 15 years of her life studying music, who had won competitions, who had felt the magic that happens when fingers touch keys and suddenly the whole world makes sense. The spark in her chest grew a little brighter. Richard was getting impatient now. Look, if you can't play, just say so, we'll understand. Not everyone has had the same opportunities in life. His voice was dripping with false sympathy, and his friends were barely containing their laughter. They thought they had her cornered. Thought they had found the perfect way to humiliate her for their entertainment. Maria took a step toward the piano. Then another step. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something had shifted but not understanding what. Richard's confident smirk grew wider. He thought he was finally getting what he wanted. That's more like it, he said, stepping aside to give her access to the bench. Don't worry if you're nervous. We're all friends here. The lie in his words was so obvious that even some of his friends looked uncomfortable. Maria reached the piano bench and stood behind it for a moment. Her hands were trembling, but not from fear anymore. They were trembling from something else entirely, anticipation, maybe, or the memory of what they used to be capable of. She ran her fingers along the smooth wood of the bench, feeling its familiar weight and shape. Any time now, Richard said, his patience wearing thin. We don't have all night. Behind him, his friends were positioning themselves to get the best camera angles. One of them was already typing on his phone, probably preparing to share whatever embarrassing video they thought they were about to capture. Maria slowly sat down on the bench. The height was wrong, of course. It had been adjusted for the professional pianist who was much taller than her. She reached under the seat and began to adjust it, her movements automatic and practiced. Richard and his friends exchanged glances, surprised that she actually seemed to know what she was doing. As she adjusted the bench, Maria felt something she hadn't felt in years. Her posture changed subtly, her shoulders straightening, her spine finding its natural alignment. Without thinking about it, she was sitting the way she had been taught to sit at a piano, back straight, feet flat on the floor, arms relaxed. But ready? Well, Richard said, noticing the change in her demeanor. Look at that, guys. Maybe Maria actually does know what she's doing. But there was a tiny note of uncertainty in his voice now, like he was starting to realize that this might not go exactly the way he had planned. Maria placed her hands on her knees and closed her eyes. She needed a moment to remember, to reach back through all the years of exhaustion and disappointment and find the part of herself that still knew how to make music. The crowd around her grew quieter, confused by her sudden stillness and focus. In her mind, she could hear her old teacher's voice. Music is not about the notes, Maria. Music is about the spaces between the notes. Music is about breathing life into silence. She had been 19 when he told her that, and she thought she understood what he meant. Now, at 42, she finally did. Maria opened her eyes and looked at the keyboard. 88 keys, black and white, each one holding infinite possibilities. She had played on keyboards like this thousands of times before, but tonight felt different. Tonight she wasn't playing for judges or audiences or even for herself. Tonight she was playing for every person who had ever been made to feel small, every dreamer who had been forced to give up their dreams, every woman who had been invisible for too long. She lifted her hands and held them over the keys. The room was completely silent now, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Richard's smirk was still there, but it looked forced now, uncertain. His friends had stopped whispering to each other and were staring at Maria with confused expressions. For a moment that felt like forever, Maria's hands hovered over the keyboard. And then, very slowly, she began to lower them toward the keys. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change, when 3 years of silence would finally be broken, when the real Maria would step out of the shadows and remind the world that she existed. The first note was just seconds away. Maria's fingers touched the keys, and the first note rang out across the ballroom like a bell cutting through silence. It was a single, perfect G, clear and pure and absolutely certain. But it wasn't just any G, it was the opening note of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical piano repertoire. The sound seemed to hang in the air for a moment, and then Maria's left hand joined in with the haunting melody that every serious pianist knows by heart. The room, which had been buzzing with whispered conversations and stifled laughter just seconds before, fell completely silent. It was the kind of silence that happens when something unexpected and beautiful breaks into ordinary life. Richard's confident smirk vanished from his face like someone had just slapped him. His mouth actually fell open a little as he stared at Maria's hands moving across the keys with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years mastering this exact piece. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't what any of them had expected. The blonde friend who had been recording everything fumbled with his phone, nearly dropping it in his shock. He had been ready to capture an embarrassing moment, maybe a few clumsy attempts at Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or some simple folk song. Instead, he was watching a woman in a cleaning uniform play one of the most challenging pieces of classical music ever written, and she was playing it perfectly. As Maria moved into the second phrase of the piece, her years of training came flooding back. Her fingers remembered the exact pressure needed for each note, the subtle timing that made Chopin's music come alive. Her left hand carried the deep, rolling bass line, while her right hand sang out the melody with a clarity that made several people in the crowd catch their breath. The other guests who had been clapping and laughing just minutes before now stood frozen, trying to process what they were hearing. Some of them knew enough about classical music to recognize the piece. Others might not have known the name, but they could tell immediately that what they were witnessing was something extraordinary. Maria felt herself disappearing into the music in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The ballroom around her faded away, the crowd of onlookers became invisible, and even Richard's shocked face blurred out of focus. There was only the piano, only the music, only the feeling of coming home to herself after being lost for so long. Her fingers danced across the keys as the piece moved into its more complex sections. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 is not a piece that allows for any mistakes or hesitation. Every note has to be precise, every phrase has to be shaped with perfect musical understanding. It requires not just technical skill but deep emotional intelligence. The ability to tell a story through sound, and Maria was telling a story. It was the story of a young woman who had dreamed of concert halls and standing ovations. It was the story of a mother who had given up everything to provide for her children. It was the story of 3 years of being invisible, of biting her tongue, of pretending that her heart didn't break a little every time she walked past a piano without being able to play it. The people with phones who had been ready to film her humiliation were now recording something entirely different. Instead of capturing a moment of cruelty, they were documenting something beautiful and unexpected. Some of them had tears in their eyes as they held up their devices, knowing they were witnessing something special. Mrs. Wellington, who had been across the room pretending not to notice what was happening with her nephew, suddenly stopped her conversation mid-sentence. She turned toward the piano with a look of complete amazement on her face. For 3 years she had employed Maria as a housekeeper, never knowing that she was living with one of the most talented musicians she had ever heard. As the piece moved through its dramatic middle section, Maria's playing became even more powerful. Her whole body was involved now, swaying slightly with the music, her face expressing every emotion that Chopin had written into the score. The technical demands of the piece seemed effortless under her fingers, as if she had been practicing it just yesterday instead of not touching a piano for years. Richard's friends stood in stunned silence. Their earlier smugness completely evaporated. The dark-haired one who had been making jokes about authentic culture was staring at Maria like he was seeing a ghost. The third friend had put his phone away entirely, too shocked to even think about recording anymore. Other guests throughout the ballroom had begun to notice that something extraordinary was happening near the piano. Conversations stopped at table after table as people realized they were hearing live classical music of a caliber they had never expected at a charity gala. Some began moving closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of Maria's performance. The piece reached one of its most technically challenging passages, where both hands have to work in perfect coordination to create cascading runs of notes that sound like musical waterfalls. Maria's fingers flew across the keys with absolute precision, her years of conservatory training evident in every movement. This was not someone who had learned to play casually. This was someone who had dedicated her life to mastering the piano. At the highest level, an elderly man near the back of the crowd whispered to his wife, "My God, that's conservatory-level playing. Where did they find her?" His wife just shook her head in amazement, unable to speak as she watched Maria's hands create magic on the keyboard. The professional pianist who had been on break heard the music from the hallway where he had been taking his rest. He came back into the ballroom and stopped dead in his tracks when he saw who was playing. As a professional musician himself, he recognized immediately that he was listening to someone with training and talent that matched or exceeded his own. Maria felt every emotion she had suppressed over the past 3 years pouring out through her fingertips. The loneliness of being far from her children, the exhaustion of working multiple jobs, the pain of having to hide who she really was, it all flowed into the music and was transformed into something beautiful and powerful. The guests who had been enjoying Richard's cruel joke just minutes before now looked embarrassed and ashamed. They realized they had been part of something terrible, that they had been ready to laugh at someone whose talent far exceeded anything they could imagine achieving themselves. Some looked down at their feet, unable to meet each other's eyes. As Maria moved toward the climactic section of the piece, her playing reached an even higher level of intensity and beauty. Every note rang out with crystal clarity, every phrase was shaped with the kind of musical intelligence that comes from years of serious study and natural talent combined. Richard stood frozen beside the piano, his face pale and his earlier confidence completely shattered. He had tried to humiliate someone he thought was beneath him, only to discover that she possessed gifts he could never hope to understand. The tables had turned completely, and everyone in the room could see it. The music swelled toward its magnificent conclusion, and Maria knew that when the last note faded away, nothing would ever be the same again. As Maria continued playing, moving seamlessly from Chopin into the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, something extraordinary began happening throughout the ballroom. What had started as a cruel joke was transforming into something completely different, and the guests were starting to realize they weren't just witnessing good piano playing, they were hearing something truly exceptional. The transition between pieces was so smooth that many people didn't even realize Maria had changed composers. Rachmaninoff's concerto is notoriously difficult, requiring not just technical skill but enormous emotional depth and physical strength. The fact that Maria was playing it from memory, with no sheet music in front of her, told everyone with musical knowledge that they were watching someone with serious training. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who had been a piano teacher for 40 years before retiring, grabbed her husband's arm. "Charles," she whispered urgently, "that woman is playing concert-level repertoire. Do you understand what that means? She's not just someone who knows a few songs. She's had years of professional training." Her husband nodded, equally amazed. He had donated to music programs for decades and had heard many professional pianists perform. What he was hearing now could easily hold its own in any concert hall in the world. How is our hostess employing someone like this as house staff? He wondered aloud. Meanwhile, several guests had pulled out their phones again, but this time it wasn't to mock or embarrass anyone. They were recording because they knew they were witnessing something special, something they would want to remember and share for all the right reasons. The cruel laughter from earlier had been replaced by genuine awe and respect. Richard's blonde friend, who had been making jokes about authentic culture just minutes before, was now staring at his own phone screen in disbelief. He had been live-streaming the event to his social media followers, expecting to share a funny moment at the expense of the hired help. Instead, his comment section was exploding with messages from viewers asking who this incredible pianist was and where they could hear more of her playing. "Dude, who is this woman?" one comment read. "She's absolutely incredible." "This is better than most concerts I've paid hundreds of dollars to see," wrote another viewer. "Why is someone this talented working as a maid? This doesn't make sense," said a third. The friend showed his phone to Richard, whose face had gone from pale to red with embarrassment. The live stream had been shared multiple times already, and people all over the internet were starting to take notice of Maria's extraordinary performance. Dr. Patterson, a music professor from the local university who was attending the gala, moved closer to the piano to get a better look at Maria's technique. As someone who had studied piano performance for over 30 years, he could immediately see that her hand position, her finger strength, and her understanding of the music were at a professional level. "This is remarkable," he told his wife quietly. "Look at her technique. Look at how she shapes each phrase. This woman has had conservatory training, probably at a very high level. I'd stake my reputation on it." His wife was equally impressed. "Should we find out more about her? I mean, if she's this talented, what's her story? How did she end up working as house staff?" Dr. Patterson was already pulling out his own phone, but not to record. He was doing what several other musically educated guests were doing. He was trying to research Maria's background. A quick search for Maria Santos, pianist, Philippines, brought up results that made his eyes widen in shock. "Good heavens," he breathed, staring at his phone screen. "This is Maria Santos. She graduated summa cum laude from the Manila Conservatory of Music. She was a competition winner in her 20s. She performed with the Philippine Philharmonic Orchestra." Word began spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Guests were sharing information they found on their phones, piecing together Maria's incredible background. The woman they had watched being humiliated just minutes before wasn't just any housekeeper. She was a formally trained classical pianist with credentials that impressed even the most educated music lovers in the room. Mrs. Chun, a wealthy philanthropist who funded several music programs, felt her heart breaking as she realized what had been happening. "Do you understand what we just witnessed?" she asked her husband. "We stood by and watched while someone tried to humiliate a woman who has probably forgotten more about music than most of us will ever know." The professional pianist, who had been hired for the evening, stood near the back of the crowd, his own face showing a mixture of admiration and shame. As someone who made his living performing classical music, he recognized immediately that Maria's playing was superior to his own. The technical precision, the emotional depth, the perfect memory, everything about her performance was at a level he aspired to reach. "She's incredible," he told a guest standing nearby. "I've been playing professionally for 15 years, and I couldn't perform those pieces with that level of skill without months of preparation. She's doing it like she practiced them yesterday." Meanwhile, Richard stood frozen beside the piano, watching his cruel joke backfire in the most spectacular way possible. Every note Maria played made him look worse. Every phrase reminded everyone in the room of how badly he had misjudged and mistreated her. His friends had stopped trying to support him and were now keeping their distance, clearly embarrassed to be associated with what had happened. The videos being shared on social media were already starting to gain traction beyond the immediate audience. People were resharing the clips with captions like "hidden talent revealed" and "never judge someone by their job." The hashtag Maria Pianist was starting to trend as more and more people discovered the extraordinary performance. A talent agent, who had been attending the gala as a guest, began taking notes on his phone. He had represented classical musicians for 20 years, and he knew immediately that he was watching someone with enormous commercial potential. If Maria was interested in returning to professional music, he could help make that happen. Mrs. Wellington finally made her way through the crowd toward the piano, tears streaming down her face. For 3 years, she had employed Maria as a housekeeper, treating her kindly but never imagining the extraordinary talent that was hidden beneath the surface. She felt ashamed of her nephew's behavior and amazed by the revelation of who Maria really was. "I had no idea," she kept whispering to herself. "I had absolutely no idea." Other guests were having similar realizations. People who had barely noticed Maria during previous events were now remembering small moments, the way she hummed softly while working. How she always seemed to know when classical music was playing on the radio, the gentle way she dusted the piano as if it were something precious. As Maria moved into the most challenging section of the Rachmaninoff piece, requiring both hands to work in perfect coordination while maintaining the emotional intensity of the music, even the guests with no musical training could see they were witnessing something extraordinary. The sheer physical demands of the piece, combined with the mental concentration required, made it clear that this wasn't just talent. This was years of dedicated professional training. The room had become completely silent except for the music. Even the waitstaff had stopped working to listen. Everyone present understood that they were experiencing something they would remember for the rest of their lives. The moment when a hidden treasure was revealed in the most unexpected circumstances. The final notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 hung in the air like golden threads, each one perfect and clear and full of emotion that seemed to reach into every person's heart. Maria's hands remained on the keys for just a moment longer, as if she couldn't quite believe that the music had ended, that she had actually done what she just did. Then, in the silence that followed, something magical happened. It started with Dr. Patterson, the music professor, who began clapping slowly and deliberately. But this wasn't the mocking clap that Richard had started earlier. This was the kind of reverent applause that happens after hearing something truly extraordinary. The kind that says, "Thank you for sharing your gift with us." Within seconds, Mrs. Henderson joined in, then Mrs. Chun, then the professional pianist who had been hired for the evening. One by one, every single person in that ballroom began to applaud, and the sound grew from a gentle patter to a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the crystal chandelier above. But it wasn't just applause. People were standing up. The elderly couple near the back rose to their feet first, their faces glowing with appreciation for what they had just witnessed. Then the music professor and his wife stood, followed by Mrs. Wellington, who was openly crying now as she clapped for the woman she had employed for 3 years without truly knowing. Within moments, the entire ballroom was on its feet, giving Maria the kind of standing ovation that most professional musicians only dream of receiving. The sound was overwhelming, echoing off the high ceilings and marble walls, filling every corner of the grand room with appreciation and respect. Maria sat at the piano bench, completely overwhelmed by what was happening around her. For the past 10 minutes she had been lost in the music, reconnected with the part of herself she thought was gone forever. But now, facing the reality of what she had just done and how people were responding, she felt tears starting to fall down her cheeks. These weren't tears of sadness or humiliation like she had felt earlier when Richard was taunting her. These were tears of joy, of relief, of finally being seen for who she really was instead of being invisible. For 3 years, she had walked through this same ballroom countless times, cleaning and serving and being ignored. Tonight, for the first time, everyone in the room was looking at her and seeing her. The applause continued for what felt like forever. People weren't just clapping politely and sitting back down like they might after a normal performance. They were cheering, some wiping away tears of their own, others shaking their heads in amazement at what they had just experienced. "Brava!" called out Dr. Patterson, using the traditional classical music term for showing appreciation to a female performer. Absolutely magnificent. His shout seemed to give others permission to be more vocal in their appreciation. "Incredible!" Someone else called out. "Beautiful!" shouted another voice from the crowd. Richard stood frozen in the same spot where he had been taunting Maria just minutes before, but everything about his demeanor had changed completely. His face had gone from pale to red to a sickly green color, as he realized how spectacularly his cruel joke had backfired. Every clap, every cheer, every tear in the audience was a reminder of how wrong he had been, how badly he had misjudged the woman he thought he could humiliate for entertainment. His friends had moved away from him, clearly embarrassed to be associated with what had happened. The blonde friend who had been recording everything looked down at his phone and saw that his live stream had been shared hundreds of times already, with comments pouring in from around the world praising Maria's incredible performance and criticizing The behavior they had witnessed earlier. Mrs. Wellington made her way through the crowd toward the piano, still clapping and crying at the same time. When she reached Maria, she didn't hesitate. She wrapped her arms around the woman who had been cleaning her house for 3 years and hugged her tightly. "Maria," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "I am so sorry. I had no idea." "How could I not have known? How could I have let this happen?" She pulled back to look at Maria's face, her own eyes red with tears. "You are extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary." The crowd continued applauding as they watched this moment between employer and employee, but it felt different now. Maria wasn't just the help anymore. She was someone special, someone whose talent commanded respect from everyone in the room. Other guests began approaching the piano, waiting their turn to speak with Maria. The music professor pushed through gently, his face full of professional admiration. "Miss Santos," he said formally, "I'm Dr. Patterson from the university. I have to ask, where did you study? Your technique is absolutely flawless." Maria wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself enough to answer. "Manila Conservatory," she said quietly, her voice still shaky from the emotion of the moment. "I graduated 15 years ago?" "Summa cum laude," added Mrs. Chun, who had found the information on her phone during Maria's performance. "And you won the International Young Artists Competition when you were 23. The crowd murmured with appreciation and amazement. These weren't just casual accomplishments. These were the kind of achievements that marked someone as a serious professional musician at the highest level. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped forward. "Miss Santos, I'm David Miller. I represent classical musicians professionally. I hope you'll consider speaking with me about returning to performance. What we just heard tonight, that belongs on the world's greatest stages." Maria looked around at all the faces surrounding her, all the people who had gone from ignoring her existence to treating her like a celebrity in the span of 20 minutes. It was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at the same time. The professional pianist, who had been hired for the evening, waited respectfully until he could speak with Maria. When his turn came, he simply said, "That was the most beautiful performance I've heard in years." It was an honor to witness it. Coming from another professional musician, this compliment meant everything to Maria. She had been away from the music world for so long that she had started to doubt whether she still had what it took to perform at a high level. Tonight had proven to her, and to everyone else, that her gift was still very much alive. Young people in the crowd were still recording everything, but now they were capturing a celebration instead of a humiliation. The videos being shared online showed Maria being embraced by Mrs. Wellington, surrounded by admirers, treated with the respect and admiration she deserved. The hashtag Maria Pianist was trending on multiple social media platforms, with people sharing the videos and adding their own comments about the incredible performance they had witnessed. Musicians from around the world were starting to take notice, sharing the clips and expressing their own amazement at Maria's talent. As the applause finally began to die down and people started returning to their conversations, the atmosphere in the ballroom had changed completely. What had started as a typical charity gala had become something unforgettable. A reminder that extraordinary people can be found in the most unexpected places, doing the most ordinary jobs, just waiting for someone to see their true value. Maria remained at the piano, still trying to process everything that had happened, knowing that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine yet. The videos from that night spread across the internet like wildfire. By the next morning, Maria's performance had been viewed over 1 million times on various social media platforms. People from around the world were sharing the clips with captions like, "This will restore your faith in hidden talents and never judge someone by their job." The story behind the performance made it even more powerful. Viewers could see the cruelty at the beginning, watch Maria's transformation, and witness the moment when everyone realized they had been witnessing something extraordinary. It wasn't just about the music, it was about dignity, respect, and the danger of making assumptions about people based on their circumstances. Within 48 hours, Maria's phone started ringing constantly. Music agents, concert hall managers, Recording studios and interview requests poured in from around the world. The talent agent who had been at the gala, David Miller, became her representative and helped filter through the overwhelming number of opportunities that suddenly appeared. The first major offer came from the Lincoln Center in New York. They wanted Maria to perform as a guest soloist with their orchestra, playing the same Rachmaninoff piece that had stunned the gala audience. When Maria heard this news, she had to sit down. Just a week ago, she had been cleaning toilets and serving drinks. Now, one of the world's most prestigious venues wanted her to perform on their stage, but the most meaningful opportunity came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, the retired piano teacher who had been at the gala, called Mrs. Wellington with an idea. She wanted to create a scholarship fund in Maria's name, specifically designed to help talented musicians who had been forced to give up their dreams due to financial hardships. What happened to Maria happens to too many people, Mrs. Henderson explained to Mrs. Wellington over the phone. Talented individuals who could enrich the world with their gifts. But circumstances force them into other work just to survive. We need to change that. Mrs. Wellington loved the idea immediately. Within a month, she had contributed $500,000 to start the Maria Santos Music Scholarship Fund. Other wealthy guests from the gala began contributing as well, many of them motivated by guilt over how they had initially reacted to Maria's situation. Dr. Patterson from the university offered Maria a position as a visiting professor, teaching advanced piano students. "Your technical skill is exceptional," he told her during their meeting. "But what impressed me most was the emotional depth of your playing. That's something that can't be taught? It comes from life experience? Our students need to learn from someone like you." The Philippine Philharmonic Orchestra, which Maria had performed with in her 20s, reached out to invite her back for a special homecoming concert. The news made headlines in the Philippines, where Maria's story had become a source of national pride. She was being celebrated as an example of Filipino talent and resilience. Meanwhile, Richard's life had taken a very different turn. The videos of his cruel behavior had made him infamous on the internet, but not in a good way. His employer, a major investment firm, received hundreds of emails and phone calls from people demanding that they take action against someone who would treat another person so cruelly. Within a week, he was asked to resign from his position. The public humiliation forced Richard to take a hard look at his behavior and his values. He realized that his whole life had been built around feeling superior to others, and that foundation had crumbled completely when Maria revealed her true talents. For the first time in his privileged life, he understood what it felt like to be judged and found lacking. 3 months after the gala, Richard did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He contacted David Miller, Maria's agent, and asked for a meeting with Maria. When they met at a quiet coffee shop, Richard looked like a different person, humbler, more thoughtful, clearly changed by what had happened. "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond just saying I'm sorry," he told Maria, his voice sincere and full of regret. "What I did was cruel and wrong, and it came from a place of arrogance and prejudice that I'm ashamed of. I've spent the last 3 months thinking about the kind of person I was, and I want to be better." Maria listened carefully, studying his face to see if his words were genuine. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I want to contribute to your scholarship fund," Richard replied. "I want to help other people in situations like yours, people whose talents might be hidden because of circumstances beyond their control. I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can help prevent others from missing out on opportunities because of people like me." Richard ended up becoming one of the scholarship fund's largest contributors, donating not just money but also his time, helping to identify and support talented musicians who needed assistance. It became his way of making amends, not just to Maria, but to everyone whose potential had been overlooked because of prejudice and assumptions. 6 months after the gala, Maria gave her first major concert performance in over 15 years. The venue was Carnegie Hall in New York, and tickets sold out within hours of going on sale. People who had seen the viral videos wanted to experience her talent in person, while classical music lovers were curious about this woman who had appeared. Seemingly out of nowhere, the night of the concert, Maria stood backstage wearing a beautiful blue gown, not unlike the one her mother had saved to buy her decades earlier. Her children, Rosa and Carlos, had flown in from the Philippines to watch their mother perform on one of the world's most famous stages. They sat in the front row, beaming with pride as they watched their mother walk onto the stage to thunderous applause. The performance was everything the audience hoped for and more. Maria played not just the Rachmaninoff that had made her famous, but also pieces by Chopin, Beethoven, and even a beautiful traditional Filipino composition that brought tears to many eyes. When she finished, the standing ovation lasted for nearly 10 minutes. After the concert, Maria was approached by representatives from major record labels wanting to produce albums of her performances. She signed with a company that specialized in classical music, and her first recording became one of the best-selling classical albums of the year. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came a year after the gala, when Maria opened her own music school in her hometown in the Philippines. The school was funded by the Scholarship Foundation and provided free music education to children from low-income families. Maria wanted to make sure that other talented young people wouldn't have to choose between following their dreams and supporting their families the way she had been forced to do on opening day. Maria stood in front of her first class of eager young students. Many of them reminded her of herself at that age, full of musical passion but uncertain about their futures. "Music is not a luxury," she told them, repeating words her own teacher had said to her decades earlier. "Music is a necessity. It's how we express what words cannot say, and everyone deserves the chance to find their own musical voice." As she watched her students begin their first lesson, Maria reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. A night that had started with humiliation and cruelty had somehow transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. She had learned that sometimes the worst moments in our lives can become doorways to the best chapters we never imagined possible, the gala incident had taught. Everyone involved important lessons about dignity, respect, and the danger of judging others, but most importantly, it had reminded the world that extraordinary people are everywhere around us, often hidden in plain sight, just waiting for someone to see their true value and give them a chance to shine.